Iram Manzil is also more popularly known as Erra Manzil. If you're from Hyderabad or if you grew up or lived in Hyderabad, you're probably familiar with a part of the city known as Errum Manzil. Many people mistakenly believe that Erram Manzil means the red building because Erra in Telugu means red. In fact, there have been some posts on Facebook which also mentioned that Erram Manzil comes from the source of a red building, which is absolutely not true. Erram Manzil is a distorted form of the name Iram Manzil, which comes from Farsi, Persian. Iram in Persian or Farsi means the Garden of Eden. In fact, there's a very popular garden in the historic town of Shiraz in Persia, present-day Iran, which is called Bagh-e-Irrum. Now, there's a fabulous Persian fable about the Bagh-e-Irrum, which is part historical and part mythology. The story goes that there was a king called Shaddad in ancient Persia, and he wanted to build a beautiful garden like the Garden of Eden. So he built a garden and called it Bagh-e-Irrum. Now the story of Bagh-e-Irrum goes like this. The king, Shaddad, he challenged God and said that he would create a Bagh-e-Irrum on earth which could rival the Garden of Eden in paradise. He used up all of his wealth to create this garden. And after using up all of his personal wealth, he was very brutal by snatching wealth away from the poor. When finally the garden was created and it was ready to be opened, it was described as a garden to have fountains of milk and wine and rocks made of precious stones and gems, a garden that anybody could ever imagine of such magnanimous beauty. But this cruelty of his is said to have upset God, and he was punished. So just when Shaddad was about to enter the gates of Bagh-e-Irrum, he tripped on the steps and died on the spot. Now this is the story of Bagh-e-Irrum from the Persian folklore. Of course, the Bagh-e-Irrum still exists in Shiraz. The story, as I said, is part fable and part history. Probably Nawab Fakhrul Mulk, who built the Iram Manzil palace in 1870, was inspired by this story, and he wanted to create a Garden of Eden right here in Hyderabad. The gentleman, Nawab Fakhrul Mulk, who had built the Iram Manzil palace, was a very, very interesting person. The palace itself, the Iram Manzil building itself, is so rich in stories and anecdotes. Some of these accounts of people who visited the palace and the stories that they narrate, they are incredible to read or listen to. The hospitality of Fakhrul Mulk, Nawab Fakhrul Mulk, was so great and popular those days that Europeans and nobles of other princely states in India used to line up to visit Hyderabad on a vacation. Fakhrul Mulk was a great builder, and he would begin construction of a new palace even before an ongoing one was completed. Right from the Nizam's 6th to the British resident, to the dukes and duchesses who had visited the Iram Manzil palace, every one of them sings paeans to the beauty of this building and the hospitality of the Nawab who ran the palace. The Iram Manzil is in fact one of the first buildings to come up on the hillock facing the Hussain Sagar. And since this was a new part of the city in those days, Iram Manzil had in fact set a precedent for several other buildings like Bella Vista, Shah Manzil around the lake, Hussain Sagar, thus opening up a rather new side of the city for development. Several scholars have also noted that the palace was built at a time when the Panjagutta Khairatabad area was considered beyond the city limits and was largely nothing but an empty rocky expanse. Before shifting to the Errum Manzil, the ancestral Devdi or the mansion of Fakhrul Mulk was housed close to the Charminar, which was then a walled city. Fakhrul Mulk, in fact, has a reputation of a compulsive builder. He had to keep building palaces or structures or something. Before he would complete building one house, he would start building another one. And the story goes that Erram Manzil was the result of a wager between the Nawab and Sarvikarul Umra as to who could build a higher palace. Apart from being located on a hillock, Iram Manzil is marked by a distinct Indo-European Baroque style of architecture. Nawab Fakhrul Mulk was also one of the first Hyderabadi nobles to mingle freely with the British officers. And given his interactions with the British in the capacity of a nobleman, adoption of their culture reflected not just in his social life, but also in his dress, lifestyle, and the architecture of his homes that he built, including the Erra Manzil. As I mentioned before, Nawab Fakhrul Mulk was a compulsive builder. His grandson, Mozam Hussain, says that it was almost like a disease for him. He just had to build. Over the course of his life, Nawab Fakhrul Mulk had built a great series of vast rambling palaces one after the other. But he was never satisfied. As soon as he had finished one, he immediately began to build another one. Sometimes he would just give an entire palace away. Once he heard that the Nizam had privately said that he envied Nawab Fakhrul Mulk for owning a palace looking on the Fateh Maidan, where all the tent pegging and polo matches took place. Now, if you knew the 6th Nizam, Mehboob Ali Khan Pasha, he was very fond of horse racing and polo matches and tent pegging, etc. So it's understandable why he envied Nawab Fakhrul Mulk for having such a fine property overlooking the polo ground. At the first opportunity, he just gave the Asad Bagh to the Nizam, even though it was his principal residence. But that was absolutely typical of him and his buildings. He never lived in half of them, but yet, when he was 75, he was still building palaces. Of course, he built up enormous debts in the process. Now, the story goes that every evening, the Nawab would go out for a walk. And with him, he would take his walking stick and this great entourage of his staff, which always included his secretary, his masons, his builders, a couple of his household poets, and the paymaster general of his estates, some 30 or 40 people in all. On these walks, whenever inspiration came, he would begin to draw in the sand with his walking stick. Maybe one day it was a new college, or a new stable block, or possibly a new palace, or whatever it was according to how the fancy took him. The draughtsman he had brought with him would jot down on a piece of paper what was drawn on the sand, and then he would draw it up and bring it to him the next day at breakfast. The Nawab would say, no, enlarge the tower, or let's put a couple of cupolas on this top. He would give suggestions and changes. His buildings were always something of a hodgepodge, as he would change his style according to his mood. Some of his buildings have a classical ground floor, a tropical Gothic first floor, and then they would suddenly change to Art Deco or even Scotch baronial halfway up. Iram Manzil is definitely not the biggest house that he built or the palace that he built, but it was definitely the house in which he lived the longest. There is this fascinating story about the Nawab's hobby of tiger shooting. Now, since tiger shooting was confined to only a few months in the year, the Nawab had built himself a railway track on which a mounted figure of a tiger was let loose and was used for target practice. Now, in the hill just behind Iram Manzil, a miniature railway track was built, and on this track was placed a stuffed tiger on the wheels. It would be let loose from the top of the hill, and Nawab Fakhrul Mulk and his sons and grandsons would all line up and fire with double barrels, bang, 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 at this animal figure which was careening down the hill on the railway tracks. Now, since this was a natural gradient down the hill, the tiger would get faster and faster as it came down. By the time it reached the bottom of the tracks, it was completely peppered, blown to bits. Then some people were employed to patch the tiger up and put it back on top of the hill once again. Fantastic stories. The Iram Manzil Palace was actually an impromptu idea of Nawab Mulk, whose real name was Mir Sarfaraj Hussain. He held the title of Mulk, which means the pride of the dominion, the same title his father also was honored with. So Mir Sarfaraj Hussain Khan was actually Mulk II. He also held the titles of Safdar Jung, Musheer-ud-daula, and of course Mulk Bahadur II. The stories of Mulk are incredible, to say the least.